Trump, okay, the tariffs war, he still intends
Yeah.
to introduce this reciprocal, they call it a reciprocal tariffs to kick in on April 2nd. Among other things, he said that he want to take like 200% on European alcohol. All right. And of course, the whole Europe
No,
now.
no more no more Chateau Lafitte for oligarchs and things like that in the US. Anyway, carry on.
Well, I pay attention to this actually because now I'm not a big alcohol
Yeah,
drinker, but I do buy European alcohol from
no,
time to time for my cooking. So, for example, I make my own vanilla
yeah.
extract, which I use absolute vodka, for example. So now I need to stock some.
Well, there you go.
But
Yeah.
anyway, so what kind of European? I mean, there is a panic now in Europe now. So what are they
Yeah.
going to do? Are they going to revenge or something? What other cards do they have to deal with this? The tariffs.
Well, they don't actually have that. They don't actually have that many cards because
Mhm.
um, even though the Europeans like to say that, in fact, there's no great trade imbalance between the United States and Europe because Europe imports American services from the United States. The reality is Europe is very dependent. It runs a significant surplus with the United States in trade in goods. And if tariffs are really about goods. So if the United States starts to levy tariffs on European goods being exported to the United States, that will affect European producers.
Mhm.
But because Europe imports far fewer manufactured goods from the United States, imposing countervailing tariffs probably isn't going to make that much of a dent to the
Mhm.
US. They could do other things. They could start putting restrictions on American social media platforms, for example.
Uh-huh.
I
Okay.
mean, they could, in theory, do those things. But the problem they have in that case is that there's no European social media platforms to take their place.
Uh-huh.
And we know that setting things up like that takes time.
Mhm.
And what are you going to do in the meantime? Are you going to deprive Europeans of all social media platforms?
Mhm.
So the reality here is that the balance of advantage is very much on the American side,
Mhm.
even if Europeans want to deny this.
And also, I just saw that the French, remember not that long ago, China actually imposed 100% of tariffs on the French cognac, right? We talked about that. And so,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, the French now decided that, I guess, at the behest of the cognac lobby, so the French foreign minister just announced the plan to visit China to talk about just that. So it seems like, for
Yeah.
example, the French cognac industry is now being squeezed on the one side by China, and then now upcoming by the US. I got a feeling, I feel like Trump sometimes like to work with Russia, with China to squeeze the Europeans. Do you think that's something to
Yeah,
look
absolutely.
into?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as I'm sure I think we discussed it previously. I mean, China is an enormous importer
Mhm.
of cognac. When I say enormous importer, I mean I don't mean everybody in China drinks French
No?
cognac, but at the very high end, the premium end, China is a major market for French cognac. And I know a little bit about the French cognac producers. There's a few big companies. Um, um, but we're talking about growers
Mhm.
mostly. If there's a reduction, I mean, they will be very, very severely affected.
Yeah.
And of course, that is an important part, not just the French economy, but more perhaps of French society, of the French conception of themselves, that they produce these sort of goods and things. So it's going to be a very, very heavy blow for them.
Mhm.
But the Europeans themselves, to some extent, are doing this to themselves because they went into these economic wars with China, and of course,
Yeah.
even more so with Russia, at the instigation of the Americans. And now the Americans are turning on them.
Yeah.
So they should not have done that in the first place.
Yeah. Now they're in a difficult situation. We will see how they deal with
Mm.
it. Um,
Mm.
regarding Trump's tariff war, have you heard that there is a term called the Triffin Dilemma? So Triffin
Yeah,
Dilemma, yeah,
it's
you
from
heard
the
about that, right?
60s. It was an
Yeah, in the
economist, yeah, in the
60s.
60s, yeah.
Yeah, so what
Mm.
Triffin Dilemma, just for my audience, is that it's for a national currency like the United States dollar, right? To serve as a world primary reserve currency, there must be a sufficient liquidity in the global markets. And this requires the issuer country, the United States, to run a persistent trade deficit to supply other nations with its currency. Meaning you actually need a deficit to get your dollar out into the market, into the world, to make it a reserve currency. So what Trump wants is he doesn't like the deficit. He wants surplus, right? He wants more money coming back to the US and then US goods going out. But that means you collect the money from, US dollars from other countries. Well, then other countries don't have the dollar. They will try to find other currencies to trade. So you see, there is a dilemma, right? There is a conflict there. Do you think Trump think this through thing? Think this whole thing through.
I'm sure he hasn't. I'm sure everything about the way Trump is working suggests to me that this administration is improvising. On the one hand, they both want the dollar to remain the world's reserve currency,
Mm-hmm.
and they want the United States to run surpluses. I mean, they want contradictory things. They want to reindustrialize the United States, not
Mm-hmm.
understanding very much what that implies, but they want policies that are inimical to reindustrialization, because one of the effects of tariffs, for example, is that it's going to make the dollar stronger, at
Uh-huh.
least in the short
Yeah.
term, which will make it more difficult for the US to export. So they want all of these different contradictory things, and they haven't really worked out at all how to do this. Now, there is a good case for saying that the United States ought to be thinking about moving away from a situation where the dollar is a reserve currency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Way back in the 40s, John Maynard Keynes, who was the British representative to the Bretton Woods Conference, warned the United States about all of this. He said, do you really want your currency to be the world's reserve currency? Do you fully understand what that means? Why don't we set up artificial currency, the
Mm-hmm.
Bancor, that will be the world's reserve currency, so that the dollar isn't a reserve currency? I mean, we've had a reserve currency in Britain before, which is sterling, and that didn't work out very well for us. It did cause deindustrialization in Britain, from being the world's biggest industrial power in the
Mm-hmm.
mid 19th century. Already by the 1940s, we've been overtaken by many other countries. So do you really want to go through that pattern yourselves? But the Americans said, absolutely. We insist that
Mm-hmm.
the dollar must be the reserve currency. And over time, it's had exactly the effect that Keynes and Triffin said it would.
Mm-hmm.
The United States imports goods and it exports dollars.
Yeah.
And as the United States has moved in recent years to self-sufficiency in energy with, shale and all of that, it's had to import more goods so that it can continue to export dollars, which has actually accelerated processes of deindustrialization in the United States. Now, there is a case for saying, forget about having the dollar as the reserve currency, except that that can't continue for much longer. You've got to think beyond the dollar,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got to start perhaps working with other countries, China mostly, to
Mm-hmm.
see whether we can come up with some kind of long-term solution which will take the place of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And that maybe is the most important thing you need to do if you really are serious about reindustrializing. Forget about tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Forget about all of these other things. Focus on this central issue, which is what the dollar is doing to you. It may look like it's making you strong, but it's like an addiction at the end of the day. You feel
Mm.
good while you're taking the drug, but over time, it is weakening you. The trouble is, the Americans can't even now see that
Mm.
because they still continue to think of the dollar as the symbol of American strength. And
Mm.
the fact that everybody around the world uses the dollar is the symbol of American strength. So they're going around telling everybody, if you dare stop using the dollar, if you even think of setting up an alternative reserve currency, which, by the way, nobody's planning to do.
Mhm.
Just to say, I mean,
Mhm.
China isn't planning tomorrow
Yeah.
to set up a reserve currency. China understands the Triffin dilemma very well, by the way, I
Yeah.
should say. I mean,
Mhm.
you follow Chinese economic writings, they don't talk about Triffin, but they've looked at this and they understand exactly what the problem with having a reserve currency
Currency,
is.
yeah.
Anyway, uh, uh, um, 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 you could talk with the Chinese about this. There's even suggestions, which I've seen for some people, that if the United States wants to move away from the reserve currency system, from keeping the dollar as a reserve
Mhm.
currency, it might even itself think about joining the BRICS, because all these platforms are
Yeah.
being set
Uh-huh.
up through the BRICS,
Yeah.
which set up alternative mechanisms
Mhm.
that look beyond reserve currencies. But of course, the United States, the great, all powerful, almighty United States, can't bring itself to do that. Because if it did, it will be another country working in the trade, working in world trade alongside other countries. It would no longer be the exceptional country that
Yeah.
sees further, knows better, does all of those things. And they've not yet reached that point where they're prepared to accept that. So you see all of these contradictions instead,
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
of these policies which don't really make any sense. They have a general feeling that things within the United States are going very badly wrong. But they're not really putting it all together and coming up with a coherent program about how to put it right in the way that, say, China did in the late 1980s, in the late 1970s and
70s.
early
Uh-huh.
1980s, as it
Mhm.
moved forward with its own reform programs.